Hello, my amazing artist. In this video, I'm going to teach you some watercolor painting techniques. When I am showing you these techniques, I'm using this regular basic set of watercolor paints. This is dry watercolor that needs water to wake it up. So to begin, I'm going to show you a technique called wet on wet. It is exactly how it sounds. So you start by wetting the paper with just water and a clean brush. While it is wet, now wake up one of the watercolors and lay it right on top of that wet paper. You have to go a little fast on this or else the water on the paper will dry. But really make sure you load that brush. I'm using a lot of water and look what happens. Right away, the watercolor is going to start moving because the paper is wet, causing that paint to move around. This is a super fun technique to experiment with. If you want your paint to move around more, add more water to your brush. If you want the color to be more bold, add more paint to your brush. Now this is the starburst technique. This technique, we start the same way as wet your paper with just water. Then add paint to this while the paper is still wet. And next thing, clean your brush, pick up either the same color or you can use a different color and literally just poke or dab the paint onto the wet surface. And you'll see they start to make these little starbursts. Because the surface is still wet and there's a lot of water, it's going to cause the paint to move around a lot. You can do this in lots of different ways. It's not meant to look one certain way. It's just a fun effect that you can play around with while your paint is still wet. This effect is also called bleeding. So the paint is literally moving and bleeding into a different area on the page. It's also referred to as blooms or starbursts. Next technique, I'm going to show you how to do some color mixing. This is not necessarily making a new color, but it's just blending one color into another color. You can do this technique by using a wet on dry process. That's where I have a dry paper this time, but my paint is wet. Because I'm using watercolor paint, I have to have it wet to be able to work with it. So I'm going to start by laying down one color and then give some space in between and lay down another color. Now what I do is I just use water and I'm going to start blending those colors together. I have to do this fast so that the paint is still wet, but using just a paintbrush with some water is going to help blend those two colors together. Now let's compare it to using the wet on wet technique. So with a clean brush, I'm laying down water onto my paper. Next, while the paper is still wet, I pick up one of my colors, boom, check out that wet on wet effect. Already the colors are moving around. Obviously, if there's more water, it's going to help the paint move more, which is going to help the colors blend and mix together. I love this technique. I think it's super fun to experiment with. So try doing either the wet on dry process or the wet on wet and see which one you like best. For this next technique, we are going to use salt to create a texture and cool effect on the watercolor. Same as last time, you can do this either with a wet on dry process or wet on wet. That is really up to you. So I'm going to show you examples of both. First, I'm starting with a dry paper and I'm laying down a color. Now, this effect works best if it's actually wet. So I'm just putting a little bit of water on top of the paint I just laid down. And then while it's not nice and wet, I'm going to sprinkle just a little bit of salt onto the wet paint. You don't need a lot, honestly, just a teeny tiny bit will work. If you use too much, it actually does not end up looking that cool. Just a small little bits have a really neat effect. Now I'm gonna go ahead and tell you that you can't really see the effect until the paint is dry. Once it's dried, then you can scrape off that salt that is still remaining and you will see how the salt affects the paint. But either way, you can try this with a wet on dry process or the wet on wet process. I find that wet on wet is a little more effective, and it's a little more effective if you use a darker color like a blue or maybe purple or green. For some reason, warm colors don't seem to work as well. But that is, of course, up to you for you to experiment and see what you like best. The next technique is to use a paper towel or a sponge. Before I show you some ideas of how to use a sponge, notice my painting here. At the top, it is very vibrant and has a lot of paint, and then there's less paint as I move to the bottom. This is called a wash. I do this by not getting any more paint on my brush, but I do add more water as I am going from the top to the bottom. If you want a consistent color, you would need to add more paint to your brush, then go on top. Okay, anyways, here's how you can use a sponge. There are a ton of sponges in the art room. You can use it by kind of absorbing some of the paint on the page. Same process here, but using a paper towel, it's going to act in the same way. It's going to absorb some of the paint on the page and create a texture. But you could also do the opposite. Now get a sponge or a paper towel, dab it into one of the paint colors, and now I'm going to place that on top of my paper. This is going to create some really cool textures, and I could even play around with mixing some of the colors together. If you ever feel that you have too much paint in one area, or maybe there's too much water, grab a paper towel and do what I'm doing here and try to mop up some of that, and you'll see how it kind of takes it away and makes a different effect. Alrighty, next technique is to use a toothbrush. So a couple ways to do this. One is you can dip it in water and then dip it into one of your paint colors in the palette there. And then we're going to splatter the paint onto the paper. So here's the best way, I think. You're going to put your thumb on top of the toothbrush, and then using your pointer finger, index finger, just rub the bristles. This is going to cause the paint to splatter onto your paper. You want to make sure your toothbrush is facing your paper and it's tilted down so you can get the best effect. You can also create lots of cool textures by rubbing the toothbrush on your paper just like you would with a paintbrush. So experiment with this today. I find this is a super fun technique to do. The final technique I'm going to show in this video is using a spray bottle. So very simply, just lay down some paint and just spray water on top. This is just water in the spray bottle, and it's going to cause the paint to kind of wake up again and become liquidy where it moves around. You can do this if you have painted an area and it's dried and you need it to wake back up, spray a little water, or right after you paint, try spraying a little water and see what happens. You could even pick up the paper a little bit, like I'm going to try to show here, and so you can see the paints actually drip and move down that paper while you manipulate it. There you go, artists. There are a few watercolor painting techniques. I'm excited to see what you experiment with today.